Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our very good friends, Sam Clement and Courtney Trush. Y'all say hello.
Hey, John.
How's it going?
I'm doing fantastically. Thank you so much for asking. But, Sam, if I were living in the Ukraine, I might not be as fantastic as I currently am here in central Alabama.
I don't think that's a false statement.
Well, for a lot of reasons. And, Courtney, not just because life is so sweet here in central Alabama and life is a little bit harder in the Ukraine, but, Courtney, as you mentioned and as you were interested in, it seems as though, good night. The Russians and the Ukrainians might lead to, they're at loggerheads right now. The Russians are massing all kinds of troops at the border. And what does it all mean for Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, let alone the United States? And what are some of the questions that you might have about what this means for everything?
Well, I think it's, obviously watching the news, they are making a big deal about any second that Russia could invade Ukraine. And I guess as an American, Americans in general, we're so fortunate that we don't worry about such things. But what does this mean for us? What does this mean for the economy and for Europe?
Well, I mean, those are great questions, because I think if you were going to ask the average American on the street, frankly, a lot of them probably couldn't find the Ukraine on a map. And even, I would imagine even some more probably never even heard of the country. I mean, truthfully, that's how I think well-versed we are in international affairs. So the question is, what does it mean for U.S. sovereignty? Absolutely nothing. I mean, Russia could take over the Ukraine. It's not going to impact whether or not the stars and stripes fly above the Capitol building. Sam, your thoughts?
Well, no. Obviously, the next step after possibly invading the Ukraine is not, moving into the southeastern parts of America. So I don't think that's the issue.
I do not
here.
speak Russian.
Yeah, I don't think they'd get along too well.
So in terms of what it means for the U.S., there's that. But of course, being the imperial power that the United States is, it does have an impact on how we conduct business and how we live our lives, and particularly with our so-called European allies. While the Ukraine is not a member of NATO, it is a buffer state between the Russian bear and NATO countries, and that's the whole thing. I think obviously NATO and the remainder of Europe either wants to keep the Ukraine either completely neutral but pro-West or in NATO. And Vladimir Putin feels the same way. He likes that buffer state. He likes Belarus being being the buffer state. So right. What we're really having here is kind of just two sides, two big guys going at each other, wanting to maintain some kind of buffer to keep the other side from invading one another. So I think that's for the United States and for the remainder of Europe. If Vladimir Putin decides to invade and would occupy the Ukraine, then all of a sudden you have the Russian bear that much closer to Poland, that much closer to Germany, that much closer to coming into to Central Europe. And for Americans sit there and go, oh, that's not going to happen. However, the Europeans have a much longer history of fighting one another than we can imagine. And old habits take a long time to die. And people are very concerned about what the Russians might do. So much so, Sam, I think I've told you, back in the 19th century, back when I was a little boy, Courtney, there was the German chancellor was a dude by the name of Otto von Bismarck, and he was asked what the secret to politics is, and he goes, the secret to politics is first make a good treaty with Russia. So Russia's always in the back of the minds of other Europeans because, they don't really understand Russians. Russians seem to be relatively bellicose, and you just never know when the bear is going to come off the step. Sam?
Well, and then you just have the amount of energy that comes out of Russia and how important that energy is to the rest of Europe, the rest of Western Europe specifically. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of energy issues, and then there's the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a private enterprise. However, there's talks of that being, a way to kind of stop the Kremlin, what have you. But that is a part that you can't really ignore with what's going on right now, is the lack of energy independence in the western part of Europe and how big of a player Russia is in that space.
So is that what keeps them basically where Europe or Western Europe is not going to necessarily do anything drastic based off this because they are reliant on Russia for energy?
Well, I would say that's a good chunk of it. The Germans have really shot themselves in the foot by wanting to get to reduce their carbon footprint and what have you, they're mandating, if I'm not mistaken, all their nuclear power plants need to be shut down. I don't know why. I mean, that's about as green as you can get in terms of producing greenhouse gases. I mean, no one really likes to have a bunch of nuclear waste around. That's not real green. But in terms of CO2 emissions, that's actually one of the cleaner forms of it. So if you do that, all of a sudden the Germans have to find a way to heat their homes, put electricity through their manufacturing facilities, for which they have plenty of them. And the cheapest, most efficient way of doing that is getting natural gas out of Russia, which has trillions upon trillions of cubic feet of it. And so Germans have actually put themselves in a situation where they're going to be even more heavily reliant on Russian fossil fuels, dead dinosaurs, than they currently are, and that's part of the problem. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. To me, there's another aspect of it, perhaps due to all the fighting that the Europeans saw in the 20th century. And perhaps due to the umbrella that the United States has put over Europe for really, what, Sam, I mean, last 70 years or so?
Yeah.
A lot of, according to a poll by WIN and Gallup International, they did a survey of all the various countries around the world. Would you fight for your country? Would you fight for your country? And in places like Germany, 18% said they would. Netherlands 18%. Netherlands 15%, Belgium 19%, Italy 20%, Austria 21%, Spain 21%, Czech Republic 23%, United Kingdom 27%, France 29%. Now, essentially, taking a look at the NATO forces in Western Europe, and not a lot of the people there living within those countries really want to go fight and die.
What was the United States?
United States was actually relatively low at 44%, which my estimation. Of course, all of that was probably in the southeast, southeast United States. Sam, I mean, it looks like you got something on your mind.
Well, I just think, you hit the nail on the head with the lack of energy independence in these countries. I mean, my favorite Wall Street Journal article of the last year was energy prices are soaring in Europe because the wind has stopped blowing. And I mean, that was the title of the article. And it seems like you're right that some of these countries continue to shoot themselves in the foot by not realizing how dependent they are on Russia, and then Russia's going out and using the strength that they have and the power that they have over some of these countries and taking what they can get right now. And it just seems like it was massively short-sighted by a lot of these countries to so rapidly try and get rid of what you and I would both agree on are some green sources of energy, to rely on sources that are less reliable, and when the wind stops blowing, you got a problem.
When the sun isn't shining.
Yeah, the sun stops shining, which most of Europe doesn't get much sunlight anyway, it seems like, and the wind stops blowing. They got issues.
It gets cold. It gets kind of cold.
He's painted such a wonderful picture, hasn't he?
Cold, wet, and
and gloomy.
Cold, wet, and gloomy, and it's going to last for the rest of your life. But in all seriousness, though, I mean, you take a look at it, that really is kind of the ace that you can say that Vladimir Putin has over Western Europe. But he really, this Ukraine thing and the Belarus thing, he doesn't have to worry about Belarus quite as much, because Lukashenko has really, for all intents and purposes, now become a puppet.
Right.
And you see the dude over in Kazakhstan has now become essentially a puppet. Ukraine is kind of standing out like a sore thumb when you take a look at all former Soviet republics, with the exception of maybe the Baltics, which I think are probably a little bit too far gone.
Lithuania is right over there, too.
Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia.
Yeah.
They're a little bit more entrenched in the remainder of Europe than I would say the Ukraine has. But the Ukraine kind of stands out to me like a sore thumb if I'm in Moscow, because the Ukraine, or at least what is now the Ukraine, for centuries was part of Greater Russia.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, the Russians would call themselves, would call the Ukrainians Little Rus, being part of, kind of diminutive, because part of a greater sphere of Russian influence. So for Moscow, they view the Ukrainians as though, what is this country here? This country has always been part of Greater Russia. Why does it want to be part of the remainder of Europe? Come on, let's get back into the fold. And it's frustrating for them to have the West continue to combat them with something that they feel is really sort of their birthright.
Well, and I think two things that are interesting is, one is it seems like Ukrainians are really trying their best to get this story at the top of the headlines and on the front of newspapers. Mm-hmm. And it seems like it's, for all intents and purposes, not really working. It seems like a lot of people just aren't that interested in it here. And then the other thing that's interesting to me is the Russian stock market. I mean, the Russian stock market is, for all intents and purposes, energy companies with some financials.
Yeah.
And we are seeing energy prices clearly have done really well of late. And their stock market's been getting clobbered. The indices, the Russian indices, are getting clobbered. So the reaction that probably is likely due to what's going on with Ukraine and the impact it's having on their markets, and then the lack of attention that the outside world's giving to it, seemingly.
Well, I mean, the thing is, kind of going back to what Courtney's original question and my response to it, I think part of that is just due to the fact that a lot of people outside of maybe Eastern, Central Europe, Western Europe to a degree, when you take a look over here in the Western Hemisphere, we really don't have a lot of ties to Ukraine.
And
Ukraine has not been a formative part of our nation's cultural development. And there are people up there in the Northeast who would scream, "I am Ukrainian," or something like that. And my wife just occasionally tests people from the Ukraine and whatnot. But it's not like the German influence on our society or the Polish influence on our society. And so Ukraine is kind of this place far apart, land that's very distant from us. And what happens in the Ukraine happens in the Ukraine, and what happens in Central Alabama happens in Central Alabama.
And the animosity towards Russia that there used to be probably isn't there to the same extent. And so I think that's at least 50% of it. The problem with people not really caring as much outside of the region is, one, you don't have a lot of skin in the game with the Ukraine, but also a lot of people don't hate Russia as much as they used to, and Russia taking things just because they can. That doesn't really seem to bother people as much as I think it would have a couple decades ago.
So what is the value add of Russia invading Ukraine?
Well, I'm not even sure necessarily if Russia wants to actually invade and occupy Ukraine as much as force some sort of regime turnover there, force enough disunity that a pro-Russian faction gets in charge. I think we've seen this really with Belarus, and that's happened really ever since the dissolution of the USSR. But we're seeing that in Kazakhstan and this other Central Eurasian stands. I mean, they've had pro-Russian governments, and I think that would be a best case scenario for Putin, is to have a puppet state in the Ukraine without actually having to run it, because the Ukrainians have not been all that successful in governing themselves nor growing their economy. It's been actually, outside of Moldova, it's been one of the biggest underperforming countries since the dissolution of the USSR.
Well, and since 2014 too, Ukraine has had some inklings towards moving west, and I think Putin specifically has always viewed Ukraine as like a historical part of Russia.
Sure.
And he really doesn't want them to join NATO, and he doesn't want a continued westward lean of Ukraine. And so ever since 2014 and the revolutions against the pro-Russian leaders there, I think that's always been kind of on their agenda, is to kind of get Ukraine to start veering back towards Russia and away from the West.
Now, Sam, you mentioned something about people not hating the Russians quite as much as they used to, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. People your generation, even Courtney's generation, probably don't have the same animosity level towards the Russians that maybe baby boomers and Gen Xers were. I mean, Courtney, I know this sounds crazy.
Yes.
Absolutely crazy. But when I was a child, we used to have nuclear
Drills,
nuclear drills where we would put our hands behind our head and hide underneath our desk in school, because you know what, that is going to save us from a nuclear bomb hitting Birmingham, Alabama. And actually at the time we had a big steelmaking industry here in Birmingham, so that was that might have been a knockout punch at that time. But that's kind of what I grew up with. The Cold War. It's just a real fear that the Russians were going to take over the world. So my generation, people older than I, view Russia with probably a little bit more angst than perhaps Sam, Gen Z. I mean, you tell me, Gen Z, what did the Gen Zs think about the Russians?
Well, I don't think people really think of them that often. I mean, they haven't been the powerhouse. I mean, I think they are a powerhouse, and I think they are a threat in a lot of areas. I think even back to 2012 when, Obama said the Cold War called, they want your foreign policy back, to Mitt Romney. Even back to then, I mean, people laughed at that when Romney was saying that Russia's our biggest geopolitical threat. But for the last decade, for the most part, people have had that sentiment that Obama had, that this was a Cold War issue and that this is 20, 30 years ago and not really the same problem. And people don't view Russia as the big threat that I think they still are.
Now, how about you, Miss Millennial? What do you think about, what does your generation think about the threat that the Russians pose to the world? And when you were growing up, did you even think about Russia?
I mean, I think that I hate to speak for my entire generation.
Well, you are. You are the voice. You are the voice of the entire generation.
I mean, I would just associate Russians with like Russian spies in movies, right? Like, I mean, that's what you kind of think. Yes, like James Bond, or the new. I think there's a show on Netflix or Amazon Prime or something like that is about if we lost World War II and what it would look like if the United States was split between Russia and Japan.
I know what you're talking about.
And I mean, so that is kind of maybe my association.
the Germans and
the man in the high castle is your association with the. Well, that's important because Sam, you mentioned it's not getting made. It's in the headlines. Yeah, we know it's out there, but people here in the office aren't talking about that much. You know, I mean, you're not at church or at someone's house going, "Damn Russians!" I can't believe what they're trying to do. It's kind of like if they do, it's almost like a fait accompli, and we'll just move on with our lives. And and that's kind of shocking in a lot of ways. And so, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, Sam, I started off by being kind of cavalier that the Russians invading the Ukraine has nothing to do with our sovereignty, but that's pretty true. And in terms of overall economic stability, probably unless we respond in some sort of bellicose manner, it probably wouldn't impact the global economy.
Well, especially when you go back to why they're wanting to invade Ukraine. It's one, they're viewing it as historical Russia again, and two, it's this kind of buffer region is what they're wanting. It's not as much of a westward expansion of Russia into new territory. It's, in their views, reclaiming and creating kind of a safety buffer region.
Well, it seems like they're just really flexing their muscles to be like, get in line, or we're going to beat you up. And then Ukraine is basically tattling on them, saying they're threatening to beat us up.
Well, it's also their own country, so I think they have their own.
I guess Putin is welcoming the Ukrainians to the gun show, and they just don't want to show up. But
it's unfortunate putting yourself in the shoes of the Ukrainian people. I mean, young men going and serving for someone just invading their country, and everyone's saying, "Hey, they're on the border. They're coming. They're gonna do this," and it just seems like everyone else is kind of.
Well, I mean,
good job.
I mean,
good luck.
Let's think about this for a second. I mean, I mentioned that survey, the WIN Gallup International Survey, where 18% of Germans said that they would fight for their country, 21% of Spaniards, 29% of Frenchmen, 27% of British folks. Netherlands at 15%. That's for their own country. Now, you were to ask them this question, people in Germany, would you be willing to go fight and die for the Ukrainian sovereignty? What do you think that number is if only 18% said that they would fight for Germany?
A lot less.
But it's also, would it matter who they're fighting?
Well, that's a good question. But however, I would imagine the Germans would always assume that they were fighting the Russians.
Yeah.
And, Ukraine is much higher on that list of I mean, they're what, in the 60s?
Yes. So according to the survey, Ukraine is 62% and the Russian Federation is 59%.
So that's a pretty strong amount of people that are going out and willing to fight for their country.
And I imagine the Ukrainians are envisioning fighting against the Russians.
Yeah. When they're being asked that question, it's not this random person who may come attack our country.
Well, they're not really assuming that the Bulgarians are going to attack from the south and the Polish are going to attack from the northwest. They're not expecting the Turks to come up in the Baltic Sea. You like that little movie?
Yeah.
Turks to come from the Baltic, not the Baltic, but the Black Sea and all that. Yeah, they're not expecting all that type of stuff. So it's kind of this weird sort of almost never land type of situation in terms of global diplomacy or military possibility, where we have a bellicose Russian Federation that wants to flex its muscle in Eastern Europe, make sure it gets what it wants, which is at worst a buffer state, and we'll just have to see how NATO responds to it. I mean, it's right now if it's kind of status quo from this point, that could be considered almost a win for both sides, and it might be what happens in order for everyone to save face. Ukraine might not be great for them. But at the same time, if Central Europe, meaning Germany largely and Austria, and Western Europe can breathe a little bit easier, that's okay too. Courtney, what do you think about that?
I think that's a good summation.
Let's just hope the wind starts blowing again.
Yeah.
Well, if the wind starts blowing again, those
sun
windmills are
starts
just going to
shining
just spinning like crazy over there in Germany, and
They
and
may
all
have
that.
the upper hand.
I mean,
Get
just-
a good gust of wind, and how the tables have turned.
I think you're not a real big fan of the German energy policy, are you?
Not exactly.
All right, well, guys, thank you all so much for listening and hearing us out here today on the topic about Russian bellicosity with the Ukrainians. As always, we love to hear from you. Also, if you have any questions or comments, please let us know. You can drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. As always, if you're interested in hearing more or reading more of what we have to say or how we think, you can always go to oakworth.com and take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab for all kinds of useful information. Guys, got any other thoughts on this?
That's
That's
it.
it.
That's all I've got today, too. Y'all take care.